There are moments in life that replay inside the human mind forever. Moments people wish they could erase. One sentence, one decision, one act of fear that changes how they see themselves permanently. And perhaps no disciple in the Bible understood that kind of pain more deeply than Peter. Because Peter was not merely a follower of Jesus, he was passionate, loyal, bold, the disciple who spoke louder than the others, the disciple who believed his faith was stronger than fear itself. But hidden inside Peter was a weakness he himself could not yet see. And the terrifying part is this: Jesus saw it long before Peter did. That is what makes Peter's story feel so painfully human. Because many people believe they know themselves, until pressure exposes what was hiding underneath all along. And perhaps tonight, millions of people silently carry the same fear Peter eventually faced. What if my faith is weaker than I thought? To understand Peter's collapse, you must first understand who Peter was before that night. Peter grew up around uncertainty. The Sea of Galilee was beautiful, but dangerous. Fishing was exhausting work. Storms could arrive suddenly. Roman taxation crushed ordinary families financially. Most people survived day by day without security. And perhaps years of surviving harsh conditions shaped Peter emotionally. He became impulsive, protective, passionate, the kind of man who reacted before thinking fully, but also the kind of man who loved deeply. When Jesus first called Peter, something changed instantly inside him, because for the first time, Peter encountered someone who saw beyond his flaws, someone who looked past impulsiveness and failure and saw purpose. Imagine how powerful that must have felt emotionally, to be truly seen, not for who you currently are, but for who you could become. And perhaps that longing still exists in humanity today. People desperately want to believe their life contains meaning beyond failure, that their weakness is not the end of their story. Peter followed Jesus everywhere. He witnessed miracles firsthand, blind eyes opening, storms obeying commands, demons fleeing in terror, the dead rising. And slowly, Peter began believing something dangerous about himself, that his devotion made him spiritually stronger than everyone else, that he would never abandon Jesus no matter what happened. And perhaps pride rarely announces itself loudly at first. Sometimes pride disguises itself as confidence, as certainty, as believing we are incapable of falling the way others do. But fear exposes human beings quickly, especially when survival suddenly feels threatened. Earlier that night, during the Last Supper, Jesus looked directly at Peter and said something deeply unsettling. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Imagine the emotional tension in that moment. Peter immediately rejected the idea. "No, never. Even if everyone else leaves you, I won't." And perhaps Peter truly believed those words. That is what makes the story heartbreaking, because he was sincere. But sincerity alone cannot overcome fear when terror finally arrives. Jesus already saw the coming collapse. Peter did not. And perhaps one of the most painful truths in human life is realizing we are not as strong as we imagined ourselves to be. Later that night, after Gethsemane, everything descended into chaos quickly. Torches moved through darkness. Soldiers surrounded Jesus. The disciples panicked. Fear spread instantly, and suddenly, the confident future Peter imagined disappeared completely. This was not the triumphant kingdom he expected. This looked like disaster, failure, death. And perhaps fear becomes strongest when reality destroys the future people expected God to give them. Peter followed from a distance after Jesus was arrested. That detail matters deeply. From a distance, not beside him, not openly near him. Fear had already begun quietly reshaping Peter's behavior. before the denials even happened. And perhaps compromise often begins the same way spiritually, not through dramatic betrayal immediately, but through distance. Small distance first, then silence, then fear controlling decisions slowly. The night air around Jerusalem was cold. The courtyard flickered with firelight. Roman guards moved nearby. Religious leaders whispered accusations, and somewhere inside Peter's chest, panic was growing rapidly because for the first time, following Jesus no longer felt inspiring. It felt dangerous, and fear changes human beings quickly. Fear makes survival feel more urgent than conviction. Then came the first accusation. A servant girl looked at Peter carefully and said, "You were with him." Such a small sentence. Yet Peter felt trapped instantly, because suddenly, his identity itself felt dangerous. And without thinking fully, he answered, "I don't..." Louder, stronger, as if increasing intensity could silence guilt itself. And perhaps guilt grows heavier every time people betray their own conscience, because human beings were never designed to live divided internally. Eventually, someone near the fire looked closely at Peter and said, "You are definitely one of them." At that moment, fear overwhelmed everything else, and Peter exploded emotionally, swearing, denying, desperately trying to separate himself from Jesus publicly. "I don't know him." And then the rooster crowed. Imagine that sound cutting through the cold Jerusalem night. Sharp, sudden, unavoidable, and instantly, Peter remembered not only the prophecy but the look Jesus gave him earlier that evening. Jesus knew, he knew Peter would fail before Peter himself understood it. And perhaps the most devastating part came next. The Bible says Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Imagine that moment emotionally, not anger, not hatred, not condemnation, just a look carrying truth Peter could no longer escape. And perhaps Peter saw everything at once in that instant, his pride, his fear, his weakness, his collapse. And suddenly, the disciple who once claimed unshakable loyalty realized something terrifying. Fear had controlled him more than faith. The Bible says Peter ran away and wept bitterly. That phrase contains enormous emotional weight, because this was not ordinary sadness. This was the complete collapse of self-image. Peter believed he was brave, faithful, strong, and now he could barely live with himself. And perhaps millions of people know that feeling personally. The feeling after failure, after compromise, after becoming the very person they promised themselves they would never become. The shame, the self-hatred, the replaying memories, the endless internal question, how could I do this? And perhaps the silence afterward feels worst of all, because guilt isolates people. It convinces them they are no longer worthy of love, forgiveness, or restoration. But hidden inside Peter's collapse is one of the most powerful spiritual truths in the entire Bible. Jesus predicted Peter's failure and still loved him completely. Think about that carefully. Jesus knew, he knew the denial was coming, the fear, the collapse, the weakness, and still, he washed Peter's feet earlier that night, still called him disciple, still stayed close. That changes everything, because it means human failure does not shock God. And perhaps many people secretly believe God only loves idealized versions of them, strong versions, successful versions, spiritually confident versions. But Peter's story destroys that illusion, because Jesus loved Peter fully, even knowing exactly how badly Peter would fail. And perhaps that is why this story continues healing broken people thousands of years later, because many viewers tonight feel trapped inside shame, haunted by old decisions, failures, addictions, moments of weakness, things they can barely forgive themselves for. But Peter's story did not end beside the fire. That matters deeply, The denial was not the end. The collapse was not the conclusion. Because resurrection was still coming. Restoration was still coming. Grace was still coming. And perhaps this is why God sometimes allows people to confront their weakness completely, not to destroy them, but to destroy the illusion that human strength alone is enough. Before the denial, Peter trusted his confidence. After the denial, Peter understood mercy, and broken people often become more compassionate than proud people ever could. Years later, Peter would become one of the boldest voices in Christianity, not because fear never existed again, but because he finally understood something profound. Human beings are transformed not by pretending strength, but by encountering grace after failure. And perhaps tonight, someone listening feels emotionally crushed by mistakes, ashamed, spiritually exhausted, afraid they have gone too far. But hidden inside Peter's darkest night is hope, because the same man who denied Jesus publicly was later restored publicly. The same man who collapsed in fear later stood boldly in faith. And perhaps your worst moment is not the final chapter of your story either. What part of Peter's story affected you most deeply? Have you ever experienced a moment where failure changed how you saw yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched your soul tonight, share it with someone silently carrying guilt or regret. Because sometimes, the people who feel furthest from redemption are standing closest to grace without realizing it yet.